I'm Kyle Malnati, your host of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. At Calibrate, we exist to help people create generational wealth through real estate. My personal mission is to encourage, empower, and educate you by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. Broadcasting from the Mile High City, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. Our esteemed guest today, I would say, holds the distinction of none of the other guests that we've ever had. We've got someone that has been a real estate broker, has been a captain in the U.S. Air Force, a captain for Delta Airlines, and an attorney. Certainly a Renaissance man. Welcome to the show, Captain William T Thompson. Captain T, thanks for being on the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast today.
Hey, Kyle, it's a pleasure to be with you, my friend, and I am really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Well, I'm looking forward to it as well, because in my hands, I'm holding The Flight to Excellence, your book, which is published by Greenleaf Book Group Press. And for our podcast audience that are the loyalists, the people, part of our Calibrate crew that have been listening for many episodes in a row, they know that we're in a series where we're interviewing a lot of Greenleaf Book Group authors. And this book, I will tell you, as I read through all the books that I have authors on the show, I was just captivated, Captain T, on the first chapter. And Ann Russell, our podcast producer, was really captivated by chapter 4. So I'm going to end up going right into chapter 4 for our audience. Attitude controls your altitude. I think as the real estate profession, or really any profession goes, you've got these ups and downs, you've got trials and tribulations, and we'll get into some of your story and how you've overcome a lot of different things. But I just love that concept of attitude controls your altitude. Obviously, it ties into your work as a pilot. What are some things that you see for some of the top producers, successful people, and how they really control their mindset? I think mindset's a very important topic in any profession, but as a real estate broker, as an entrepreneur, I think that mindset is really key. And so what are some things that you've picked up along your career on how you can control your attitude?
Well, that's a great question. And it is about mindset, because the reality of a 4-letter word, I call it a dirty little 4-letter word from time to time, is that we can't control often life. A lot of things we can control, but there are a lot of things that are just happening to us that are beyond our control. The one thing that we can control is how we react to those things. And very often you can have one set of occurrences that affect two different people, and they have totally different reactions to it, and consequently totally different outcomes as a result thereof as well.
Yeah, I can think of my own life just in the past 5 or 6 months, and I'll be vulnerable and I'll be transparent with the audience. I have a lot of successes in my real estate brokerage career, but I've had 2 heartbreaking deals that have crumbled. And I don't mean that to sound overly dramatic. Obviously, there are far more greater tragedies in the world than a deal not working out. But these were 2 that had a lot of relationship equity built up and then very quickly broken down. And in both of these transactions, they would have been game changers for me in the past quarter. And the really interesting thing is the same broker picked up each of those transaction relationships after my failed relationship. And this is someone that no longer works at our company anymore, but is someone that I know very personally. And both of those situations were successful for them. So I've got to sit back and think and be very transparent about it, that the problem is probably me. Of course, there are other things outside of the transaction that I had nothing to do with, different buyers that I was working with versus this other person. But just, when you get into those funks and you realize, okay, the central character here, as Michael Jackson would have said, rest in peace, Michael Jackson. But you got that man in the mirror experience where all of a sudden you have no one else to look at but yourself. And you offer some tips to your reader in The Flight to Excellence of ways that you can really get yourself out of that funk when your mindset's not right. And so you start with saying it's all a mind game. But then you talk about acting positively, speaking positively. No one likes a whiner. Let's go through some of these different reminders that you've come up with as a way of really getting out of that funk.
Yeah. And as you talk about that particular chapter, I give a great example of how I went through, from a mindset standpoint of view, four different emotions, if you would, around one particular instance. And in that instance, I had a couple of guys back in my high school days who were giving me a hard time. And I started out with the emotion of fear, because two of them just wanted me. They were threatening to, quote unquote, beat me up, and the whole bully thing. And I was afraid, 2-1. But as time went on, I realized that they were just a bunch of hot air, right? Because they never did anything. And so I went from being afraid to being angry with them. And then as time went on, for one reason or another, I started thinking about what they were doing, and it became funny to me. And so as I thought about that whole process, that I had been dealing with the same set of circumstances externally, but internally, I was going from fear to anger to then just disregarding them, and then finally thinking they were funny. Four different emotions, yet the circumstance had never changed. And that's when I realized, okay, to your point, I'm the guy in the mirror. These are the emotions that I'm going through, and it's all about me. And my final reaction to them is what made them go away. I was laughing at them, and they thought, well, this is a waste of time. Let's, go pick on somebody else. Another instance that I talk about in the book is when I had the opportunity to be considered for the board of directors of a major financial institution. I've been recommended by a good friend of mine and to a CEO. The CEO called me up for lunch, and we had a great lunch with a couple other board members. And I was convinced that I was going to be picked and be the new board member. The CEO called me back and told me that we had a great lunch. They were very impressed, but they decided another direction. And I was crushed because I had expected this. But he did say, I want to keep you involved. We like you. We'd like you to be on the advisory board instead of the board of directors. And my response was, because of my ego, I'm more in tune to being a decision maker as opposed to being an advisor. And, I think I'll turn that down, but I appreciate it. And he said, well, don't make a decision so hastily. Why don't you think about it for a couple of days and then call me back? And I did that. I reached back out to my mentor who had recommended me to tell him what the circumstances were. And he said, there are a lot of good reasons for staying engaged and not turning down that advisory board opportunity. Put my ego in check, called the CEO back and told him that I would be honored to be on the advisory board. Totally different change in my attitude because of some mentoring from a guy that I really respected. Well, long story short, about a year or so later, being on the advisory board, the CEO called me up, invited me to lunch again. And I thought he was there to pitch me doing more business with the organization since I was involved with it. And to my surprise, he said, we have an unexpected resignation from the board, and we'd like you to be our new board member. And so because I had changed my attitude, and he mentioned that fact at lunch, he said, you handled it well when you came on and became not only an advisory board member, but you were a good advisory board member. And I would reach out to the CEO from time to time with a little note whenever I read in the financial press some of the accomplishments of the organization and that sort of thing. And so once again, changing my attitude about that particular situation ended up being a very positive thing for me. And so that's the whole concept of attitude being your altitude, because how we react to things to a great extent determines the outcome ultimately in whatever it is you're dealing with.
I like to zero in on both of your examples. Let's go with the more recent one, but I want to get back to the high school experience for our audience so that they can make sure that they understand the context around that. But the more recent one, I think, is one that's apropos to real estate agents. I can think of multiple situations. And of course, 80 or 90% of the things that I do end up working out and being successful. As I think about different assignments and different presentations, and you come to a certain point in your career where you feel like more often than not, you end up getting picked as the person that someone might hire to sell a property for you. But you have those losses, those bitter losses, where someone like in the board situation where you don't get picked for what you want. And it's frustrating, and you can wallow in or even think of this negative talk about almost a victim thought process of, well, I never kind of get this, or this opportunity doesn't work out. And it's hard. It's really hard, Captain T, I think, to take maybe a lesser role and play that waiting game, maybe in the minor leagues, as you're waiting to get to that role that you really wanted. And I commend you for that. But what was that mental conversation, if you could take yourself back over that course of a few days, as you were encouraged to maybe just really give it some consideration? What did you go through, the thought process, and what brought you really around to making the decision to take maybe what was perceived as a lesser role to then a year later get the role that you really had applied for and wanted?
That's a good question. And I will answer it in that specific circumstance, but I'll broaden it a little bit as well. And so I get the call. I'm not going to be the board member. And, you get a hot flash, right? Because it's like, oh no, I knew this was going to work. And now all of a sudden it didn't. And so the immediate reaction is disappointment, understandably so. But again, and I'll emphasize, your ego kicks in, right? And so consequently, it's not about you, it's about them. And they don't realize what they have missed out on by not inviting me to the board, right? That's why my initial reaction to the offer to be on the advisory board was, no, I don't want to do this. You didn't pick me for what I wanted to be, and I'm not going to settle for this lesser thing. And that's a human nature sort of thing. What I have learned since then is that you never verbalize that. And in this particular case, I verbalized it a little bit, but not to my detriment, because the way I responded to it was that I was more of a decision maker rather than, an advisor. But the big thing in that situation was talking to my mentor, who was a guy who had been at the highest levels of government, and also had left government to be CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And I felt an obligation just to circle back to him, to thank him for his recommendation and to let him know what the outcome was. And having the opportunity to talk with him and be mentored by him, to say, hey, there are a lot of good reasons why you should consider being still connected with the corporation. And who knows what might happen in the future. And so I had to take a step back. And even with the conversation with him, I was still inclined not to do it. But first of all, some time, which is why it's always a good thing to sleep on things. As people say, let me sleep on it for a night before I make a decision, because time gives you the opportunity to give it more consideration, to kind of look at the pros and the cons, which you might not do in the heat of disappointment or in the heat of battles, so to speak. And just considering what had been given as advice, when I put the ego aside, it made sense. I have since also learned that I never react to things anymore straight up front, because even when I'm disappointed or it's not what I expect, it's always better just to take it under consideration, leave the room or go home and think about it some more, or sleep on it or whatever. And very often you come up with a different attitude about the whole thing. And that's what happened in that particular case. And I not only learned from that experience myself, which I just commented on, taking a step back and thinking about things before I respond in a negative way often. So that was a big takeaway in that particular case. And it has since now become my method of how I deal with things. So when you get that disappointment, just kind of accept it for a second, take a step back, and take some time for yourself to think about why, how, next move, that sort of thing.
So, Captain T, that sounds like a really mature, well thought out, from a lot of experience response. And there's a part of me that kind of says that is wonderful that you have the perspective of taking some time to make the decision, not reacting in the moment. All those things make sense. But I would imagine that that's probably taken you a long time to kind of get through the maturity and the experience of actually having that response, because that's not natural. That's not what we normally do, especially when you have things that are going on that you feel like are true injustices. And I had shared that we'll get back to the high school situation where the couple of guys are trying to bully you. And to set the scene there, you grew up in South Carolina. you chose, as I was reading your book, you chose to go to a school that was becoming integrated during the civil rights movement. And I will say, as a white male, I don't know how to express this, and I hope I do it the right way. That you were African American, and that was a decision for you. That you were, I think, one of 12 kids out of 1,000 kids in this high school, and so you were choosing a very hard path, and that was going to be 4 years of the first couple of kids to be integrated into this high school. So as you set the scene, it wasn't just bullying. It was, I mean, there was prejudice that was happening, and it was happening to you regularly.
Me and all the other black kids that were at the school. Yeah. Yeah. It was an interesting experience from a number of different perspectives. Number one, my parents been active in the civil rights movement in South Carolina there. Not very, very active, but I became very active. I joined what was called SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was founded by Dr. Martin Luther King and some other civil rights leaders, and as a teenager. And in fact, I was arrested the first time for demonstrating when I was 12 years old. And then I got arrested again at age 14 and spent the night in jail for a night, which was the summer before I went to Orangeburg High School. So they were interesting times, turbulent in some respects, but felt that even at a young age, I was having an effect on a movement larger than myself and something that needed to be done from the right thing to do standpoint of view.
Well, and it may or may not matter, but I commend you for stepping into that, because there's a lot of people that would not have had the courage to make the choice, because you had that decision of going to the integrated school that was mostly white versus another school that you would have had a lot of other people that you would have known and been friends with. And so step one is you stepped into that fear, and that was a courageous effort. But then I was just captured by the story of you riding the bus to the first day of school, and waiting for the bus, because in your neighborhood, you were one of the only kids that was going to that school. So you're standing by yourself, and you see police cars coming up with their lights going, but no sirens. And you're kind of wondering what was going on, if maybe they were reporting to a crime or an incident. And then you realized you were getting a police escort to school, which at first momentarily sounded kind of neat. You think of an SEC football team that has a police escort or whatever, but the reality was, as you were greeted at the school on day one with baseball bats and axe handles and people banging against the bus, I was taken to, as a white kid, I was taken to the movie Remember the Titans, where they kind of show that scene of football is one thing with black and white and integrating a school, but once you actually are going into the school for classes, is quite a different world. And so you talk through that, that concept. And before having read your book, my one reference point again was just the movie Remember the Titans, and it felt like it played out as a very similar experience for you, where on the football field there was an opportunity to be hit and hit people, so there's an opportunity there to settle the score, and that was an area that you excelled in. But then also in the classroom, you started to see some prejudices, right or wrong, kind or not kind, where you were on a certain college preparatory class, and then all of a sudden your classes got dropped because they thought that you wouldn't be able to handle the rigors of it. And so let's talk about what some of those experiences were like as a young adolescent. It's kind of maybe easier in your later phases of life to be more mature about things because of experiences like you experienced as any high school student would, where you're just trying to fit in.
Yeah, that's. I think that's a good summation, if you would. That experience at Orangeburg High over 4 years, and of course, as time went on, the situation changed slowly, but little by little, it got better. But I think, brought a level of maturity to me that it had to, because you're dealing in those situations. And it's funny how, once again, back to attitude, you look at certain things that are going on, and initially you may have one reaction, but as time goes on, you have another. And I'll give you an example of that. There were two different lunch hours at the school, and I happened to be in the second one with one other black kid. So the other black kids, the majority of them had the opportunity to kind of hang together at lunch. And that opportunity wasn't available to me because I was assigned to that other lunch hour. And I would show up in the lunch line, which extended outside of the lunchroom, and everybody would jump to the side and let me go forward because nobody wanted to stand next to me. The old fallacy that we don't want to get too close to him because the black might rub off, right? And so I'd walk by everybody and they'd move off to the side and I'd get right up to the front of the lunchroom. Well, as I thought about that, time went on, I thought, this is a pretty good deal. And so when I would show up and they didn't see me, I'd make myself known, so to speak, so everybody would get out of the way so I could go on up to the front of the line. And then one day, I remember guys saying, well, why should I let him get in front of me? He used the N word. Why should I let, the N word get in front of me? And then that was the end of that. Nobody ever moved anymore. And my little advantage of getting to the front of the lunch line went away. And so you would see these small things begin to happen. I'd sit down at the lunch table initially. It sat maybe 24 people, 25 people, or something like that. And everybody would get up. And the lunchroom was packed. And there would be 24 empty seats and me at a table. And kids would be standing up with their trays eating. And I thought, that is crazy. But if that's what they want to do, go for it. And as time went on, I remember one day everybody jumped up and this little girl said to her friend out loud so that I could hear it, said, well, if I sit down here on the end, I won't be too close to him. So why don't we just sit down on the end? So the two of them sat back down and had their lunch and everybody kind of looked at them sitting at the table with the black guy. As time went on, that distance began to get smaller. And a couple of other people sat down over on the end. And as time went on, it ended up being maybe just a couple of chairs in between me and everybody else. So the majority of the people were still sitting at the table. And so you would see these small, I'll say, victories in a sense. Not that it mattered to me one way or the other, but people's attitude began to change. And progress was being made, albeit not necessarily for the right reasons, but the situation slowly began to change. And so it was very interesting, I used that word before, to see these changes in human nature as time went on and how they came about and the underlying reasons for it, because people may have been taught one thing at home, that sort of thing, but now they're dealing with the reality of being exposed to a person of another color, and their reactions slowly change because they're dealing with the reality.
I appreciate you stepping into that conversation with me, because it's not an easy one, and it might be one that, frankly, as a white guy, I could avoid. Right, I could choose to
Mhm.
not kind of go through this discussion, but I think at any time it's important, and a way of relating. Certainly, I've never had to deal with racial injustice or prejudice, but I have been a kid that has gone to 3 first grades. I moved in the middle of 8th grade across the country from the East Coast to Colorado, and so I started in the middle of 8th grade, which that was the year before high school for us. I went
Right,
to 2 different high schools, so I mean I've been the new kid, and the
right.
kid
And that's tough
that
too.
yeah, it is,
Yeah,
and
I get
it,
it. Yeah.
it's a discussion, I think, around adaptation and trying to fit in, but while still being yourself. And I was really honored to read through your thought process, especially as it related to football, where you were basically trying to, for lack of a better description, align yourself with a couple of people. And on the football field, it felt like, all right, this is a little bit more, we're teammates here. Obviously, the coach was definitely sharing that with multiple people, trying to show that prejudice. He's like, look, you can go find another sport to play. If your locker's next to a guy that's a black guy, I don't care what you have to say. Like, you're either on the team or you're not. And it was a little bit more settle the score there. Did you play well? Did you not play well? But then as you worked through the process of being in the classroom with boys and girls, you found a way to create sort of some alliances and allegiances through football that made people feel like, okay, we're going to give him a little bit more of a benefit of the doubt because he knows this person or that person. And you shared the story of your teammate and how his girlfriend was maybe a little bit more negative around it. And then she started to come around a little bit. And that was a story that Captain T, I just, as we're thinking about adapting and trying to find your way maybe in a new circumstances, what are some lessons you learned as it related to working with your teammates and then having that translate into the school?
Yeah, that was an unexpected and positive observation that I had. Again, and you've kind of laid the groundwork with respect to being on the football team, because what happens is you can hit and be hit. And the bigger issue is everybody wants to win the game, right? And so the
And in the
motivation is,
South, I mean, football is like a religion. I mean, not to be
yeah,
blasphemous, but
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. And so consequently, given that background, number one, being in the South, high school football is a big deal, and everybody wants to win. And so what happens is you begin to have those alliances, even though you start out with the same sort of prejudices that are going on. I say up on the hill, which is, from the football field back to the regular part of school. And in my particular case, the story that you're talking about, one of the star football players actually spoke to me up on the hill. Now, guys would talk to me down on the field, but in the regular school arena, maybe not so much. Except one of the stars with his girlfriend walked by one day and he said, "Hey, Willie, how you doing?" And surprised me as well. Quite frank, surprised his girlfriend too, because I heard her comment, that you spoke to that N word. And his response was, "Yeah, he's a pretty good old guy." And so I subsequently saw her a day or two later by herself. She looked at me and kind of gave me a slight nod, which is hi, without verbalizing it. And I realized that his reaction to me had influenced her reaction to me. And so since, he was a big man on campus, so to speak, and it was observed that he had spoken to me, then his girlfriend said, "Okay, well, it must be okay for me to give him an acknowledgement as well." And so I thought about that experience and thought that I could probably use it in the classroom as well. And because I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but I'd been a kid back in the college prep courses, and there was one course that was deemed to be particularly difficult, and I had done extremely well on a standardized test. Didn't know it at the time because I'd gotten my test results back and I didn't have a context for what my score was compared to everybody else. As it turned out, I'd gotten the highest score on the test of anybody taking it, and there were some upperclassmen taking that course as well. And the reaction was phenomenal in that I guess to some extent I was expected to be a good football player, but I wasn't expected to perform in the classroom. So I thought that I could use the same experience from the football field, maybe in the classroom as well, given that I had this new notoriety around that. It gave me an opportunity to once again build some different alliances, not necessarily just on the athletic field, but also in the classroom.
Well, Captain T, I appreciate you kind of going down this path with me because I believe it's incredibly important with the platform that I have to share these stories because a lot of white kids with privilege, especially, someone of my age where I was born in the 80s and haven't seen a lot of what you've talked about. It's important to hear these stories. And what I believe is that it's a conversation about changing people's perspectives
Yes.
and that you were willing to step into a lot of these situations. And sometimes you kind of knew what was going on, and other times, like you said, and I love the story, reading it and then hearing it again about that test and in your class, the standardized test, and just how all of a sudden it changed people's perspectives. And where I'm going with all of this is that in the real estate industry, fair housing is a big deal. It's supposed to be a big deal, but there's always been or maybe in certain areas, there has been, I should say, an undercurrent that may not seem so fair. As it relates to changing perspective, it's something that I think in a realtor's life, there are going to be things that happen that are important to say that you really want to have a perspective where you're not making any judgment and you're trying to keep things to the facts. And I think that's really important for all of us to consider is that really until you've actually communicated with someone, shared ideas, had experiences with them, you don't really know where someone stands on something. And any situation where someone might have preconceived notions or prejudice, of course, sounds intellectually incorrect, but it's just not how human nature is. And so I appreciate you walking through that with us. Let's go to let's take flight, as it were. Obviously, the book is called The Flight to Excellence. You've been a pilot. You've been with the Air Force Academy, and one of the things I captured is just the level of excellence, and especially for cadets that are newbies. That is something you shared as the upperclassmen and obviously instructors. And you've had several roles within the Air Force, as well as now you also shared that you were a captain with Delta, which in many regards may have been even harder than becoming a captain in the Air Force. Let's talk about excellence, a standard of excellence, and what that has taught you, being someone that's kind of gone through that process, but then also as an instructor and as someone that's got the expertise and trying to impart that on the new classes. Why do people shy away from excellence, and what are some common themes that you've seen where really that culture of creating a system around excellence really brings out the best in all of us?
Yeah, well, I think the final analysis, and this is certainly an oversimplification, and I accept that, but just from a discussion standpoint of view, most of us are just lazy. So there are things that we know we should do, we know we need to do, but we don't lean into it or we procrastinate. And that's a human nature. It's how we come into the world. We come in pre-programmed in a sense to take the path of least resistance. And there is neurological evidence, scientific studies to back that up. And I won't go once again too deep into a rabbit hole, but it's been proven there's an area of the brain called the ventral tegmental area, which controls motivation and reward. And it gets back to chemicals, dopamine and serotonin and things like that, right? But the reality is that you can overcome the pre-programming and create a new habit pattern for yourself, because this is what it's all about. I can remember, and this is not in the book, but I think it's a good part of that discussion. I was a volunteer for the American Cancer Society for a number of years, I think over 20 years. Started out at the local level as a volunteer, served on a local board, went to the state board, chaired the state board, and ended up on the national board of directors of the American Cancer Society. And over that period of time, it became clear to me that lifestyle, to a great extent, affected a lot of different types of cancer. Exercise and eating right, to a great extent, affected lung cancer. If you don't smoke cigarettes and you stay in good shape, you're probably not going to have lung cancer. I mean, you can go down the line, right? And so I knew this intellectually. And at some point, I said to myself, well, you know what? I need to start eating more fruits and vegetables, right? And so I started buying more fruits and vegetables, but I also bought the potato chips and all the other bad stuff that I like, salty, sweet stuff. And so I had the good stuff there, but when I would get up because I wanted a snack, I'd still go grab the bag of potato chips, right? And then as time went on, I'm throwing the fruit away because I never eat it. I buy it because intellectually I know that's what I should do, but I'm not doing it, right? And then I read an article about changing habits. And the gist of the article was that if you could just stay with something on average, it varies from person to person, but for a month to 2 months, that you would establish a new habit pattern. That was the battle, that 30 to 60-day change, whether it's exercise or, eating the right stuff or any habit you're trying to break and create a new habit. And you know what? It took me about 6 weeks to break the old habit and to develop the new habit. Now, of course, this was years ago, but what I get up and eat a bowl of strawberries and blackberries and blueberries, cut up a banana. That's just what I do. And every once in a while, I'll sit down and eat some pancakes and some eggs and some bacon, and I'll enjoy it, right? But that's not my habit pattern. And I'll have to revert right back the next day to what my normal habit pattern is. And so the bigger issue there, we come in basically being lazy and taking the easy way out. But if you can concentrate on changing that and stick with it for a relatively limited period of time in the scheme of things, in the scheme of a life, 6 weeks, not that big a deal, right? That you can go down a different track. And excellence is all about that, putting the laziness aside and focus on doing the things that we know in most cases we should be doing, but we shy away from it because of procrastination, because it's easier to resist change. It's easier to stay in your comfort zone and to not do those things that we know we should do, or that if we did, we'd be in a much better position in life, but we never get around to doing it. And so that's to a great extent why I wrote the book. And I also offer a process in addition to the stories that we've been talking about. I offer what's called the P4 system for creating a culture of excellence in your life. And the 4 Ps are having the right principles, because if you don't have the right principles, it doesn't matter. Just look at some of the most notorious people in life: Hitler, Stalin, Saddam Hussein. These are guys that had power, they ran countries, they had untold wealth. And how do we remember them today? As pariahs of history, because they didn't have the right principles. All that other stuff didn't matter, right? And number two, the second P is people. You want to surround yourself with good people and the right people, given the situation that you're in. And particularly if you're the boss, you want to be good to the people that you lead. The third P is a plan. I call it a flight plan. And to put that in context, I will tell you that I have, as a professional pilot, 18,772 hours. That equates to 112 weeks, 26 months of being in the air. And I have never, ever, not even once, taken off without knowing exactly where I plan to land. And so, as the old saying goes, begin the journey with the destination defined. Well, pilots were doing that long before Stephen Covey said it. And finally, the final P of the 4 Ps is performance. You got to have a bias for action, a motivation for doing. You got to be able to perform. And if you use that 4P system as a guide, I think that takes you a long way toward building a culture of excellence, either in your business or in your personal life.
It's so great. And I love this when this happens on a podcast. I was dialed in literally to page 24, where it goes through that 4P system. We've covered a lot of different aspects of your book, The Flight to Excellence, but I see that right in front of me and I've highlighted it: principles, people, a flight plan, and performance. And most people gravitate to the last P, right? It's what you see on the outside, that performance,
Because he won't do the right thing
yeah.
in a given situation. And so it catches up with you eventually. It just like those big names that I mentioned, they had a run for a period of time, but it always catches up with them. And I mean, look around. You can see in society today, Bill Cosby, a guy I've had lunch with before. He might be a great guy in some other areas, but he didn't have the right principles across the board, and it caught up with him eventually. And the guy's in jail now. Bill Cosby's in jail. And so, or Matt Lauer. I used to look at his TV show, but because you don't have the right principles, it will eventually catch up with you. Even if you get a lot of fame and fortune and power, you just can't get away from it in the final analysis. So have the right principles to begin with, and you don't have to worry about it. Do the right thing for the right reason and try to do it in the right way. And even when you make a mistake, people will take all that into consideration.
Yeah, it's great advice. And I've seen that in my own brokerage business, just even as recent as just a few weeks ago. You make a mistake and you admit it. And I happen to be working with, I know that you're an attorney. I happen to be working with a couple of clients that are attorneys. And they said, you know what, this type of stuff happens. And it didn't end up being a big deal in the grand scheme of things. It wasn't overt. It was a real accident. It wasn't anything that was misleading or that I
Right.
was withholding information. And they said, they teach you in law school, and then they of course teach you at our law firms, that the first thing you need to do when something like that happens, first thing you do is talk to your client and admit the mistake and share it. And then you can create a strategy on how to deal with it as it relates to the negotiation. So it's great advice. And it's something that I've seen personally, just even in the last couple of weeks. Something I captured, Captain T, in your description there of habits and sort of breaking that habit. And I think we've all heard that 30 to 60 days. And sometimes people say 21 days, but Gary Keller in his Millionaire Real Estate Agent book made sure to share that it's actually more like 45 to 60 days where that habit sinks in. And there's all sorts of great works about creating good habits. I've got to think about your military experience and probably other experiences where some might call it boot camp. Others might call it basic training, but there's a reason that it's 6 weeks or 8 weeks, because it really, you kind of almost have to hammer that excellence in, and those fundamentals. And just as we start to close our show, and before we get to our rapid fire questions at the end here, Captain T, just any thoughts and experience about training others that are going through this excellence journey that, clearly as it relates to being human, is not natural. It's not natural to be disciplined and to have inspections in your dorm room as a young cadet in the Air Force Academy. So what does that process of 6 to 8 weeks and kind of that heavy boot camp or basic training really do for someone?
What it does is it gets back to the statement that you made at the very beginning of the podcast. Changes your mindset. And to a great extent, when I am asked sometimes, what did I get out of going to the Air Force Academy? It was the knowledge or the feeling that I could accomplish anything if I put my mind to it. Because in that situation, they make you accomplish things that you don't think that you can accomplish, whether it's physically or mentally. That's why you run the 5-mile run with the rifle, and go through that basic training, because in a sense, what they are doing is saying, you can do more. And we're going to push you to do more, because we know that if you are left to your own devices, you're not going to do more, right? But we're going to put you in a situation where you have to do more. And what that does is changes your mindset, because you look back on it and you say, geez, I got through that. This other stuff is easy. I can get through this without a problem. And so that is the biggest takeaway from going through that transformation, if you would. And so it is good to push yourself, but you're not going to push yourself often. And most people, because of that natural tendency, will shy back or step back or not go through. But if you are in some situation, I'm not suggesting everybody's got to go through basic training, but you got to push yourself and understand that we all can do much more than we ever think that we can do. And once you have accepted that reality, then it's amazing how both opportunities and accomplishments just open up. I mean, I grew up in segregated South Carolina. I'm a Black kid, right? And I was so far away at the time from being able to fly a supersonic jet or sit in the cockpit of a jumbo jet. It was beyond imagination. Yet I've done that. Become a lawyer, be qualified to argue before the Supreme Court of the United States. And here's the key thing. I'm not that talented a guy. And I say that in all honesty. I wasn't born with any special gifts or unique talents, but I've accomplished what other people view as some amazing things, in great part because I have stepped up and had the discipline that I have learned to go ahead and do what was necessary to get the job done. And if people can understand that you can do so much more in life, every one of us can. Now, maybe you can't do what T Thompson has done, but you can do what Kyle can do, and you can do it to the best of your ability, not my ability or John's ability or Mary's ability, but the best of your ability. And that's my definition of excellence, doing the very best that you can do. And if you do that, then excellence becomes a personal choice. And we can all do that, the best that we can do.
Captain T, thank you. We've been at this 40,000 foot experience here. We've been flying high at 6, 7, 800 miles per hour, and we're going to land the plane here. We got 3 questions that we ask all of our guests, rapid fire here. And you ready for that as we close out our show?
Let's rock and roll.
All right. Our podcast, Calibrate Real Estate, is all about making adjustments, performing at your highest level, but also taking note of observations along the way. And the definition of the word calibrate, I love it because it's a verb, it's an action, is to make adjustments using experimental results, that trial and error approach, taking external factors into account and allowing comparison with other data. So I just got to ask you, Captain T, what do you do on a regular basis to calibrate your own life?
When I get in bed at night before I go to sleep, I review the day. What was it that I've accomplished? And then I plan for the next day. What is it that I'm going to do tomorrow? What are the 2 or 3 key things that I will absolutely get done? And sometimes there's 7 things on my list. And if it's a good day, I'll get through everything. but there's these key factors that I'm going to do. And then at the end of the day, that night, I review the day and see if I was successful or not. If not, why not? And what adjustments or calibrations that I'll make for the next day. And I do that on a monthly basis as well. I look back over the month and calibrate or recalibrate as the case may be.
And Captain T, do you record that? Do you put it down in a journal or anything, or is it
I
just a
just
mental process?
pen and pencil.
I love it.
It's, I keep a notebook by my bed because sometimes I get inspired at night, or I may get up to use the restroom at my age, and have a thought, and I got to get it down because if I don't, I'll forget it by the time morning rolls around. But yeah, I make a list. Got them right here.
I
Just
love it.
yeah, yeah, and
Love it.
whatever works for you.
I think sometimes the low tech, simple, just easy. Hey, I'm going to jot this down. Keep that book with me. I think that's great advice. Question number 2 is the advice you wish you knew when you're 22. And we kind of covered a lot of ground here in that arena, but you've written an entire book, The Flight to Excellence, about life experiences and how you can continue to be excellent. If you were writing yourself a letter, and maybe this book is a letter to yourself in your 20s, if you could distill it down to maybe one piece of advice, what would you share with your younger self in that idea that you could write a letter to yourself, sharing some experiences and some advice?
I would have started saving and investing earlier. I would have started as soon as I got a regular paycheck, putting a substantial amount of that money aside. Now, as it turned out, I didn't start until I was 31, 32. But man, if I'd had another 10 years, there's a great illustration of how two people, I think they're age 19, if I remember correctly in the illustration. One person saves $2,000 a year for about 10 years and stops. The other person starts at 28 or 29 and saves $2,000 a year until they're age 65. And the person that started at 19 and stopped at 28 and let it ride had over $1 million. The person who started at 28 and did it until they were 65 had about $100,000 less. And so if I could do anything over again, it would be saving and investing as soon as I can. And I have fortunately passed that on to my kids, and they're youngsters, and they got a lot more money now than I had at their age. One's 26, one's 31, and they both got Roth IRAs and 401ks, and it makes me proud. In fact, I can remember my daughter closing on her second house. She kept the first one, real estate as an investment, and they were using VA to finance it. And so there had been some mistake in the calculations, and they needed to come up with some additional money at closing. And she was telling me about it. And I said, well, honey, I'm here to help you out. I've always told my kids, if you are helping yourself, then dad's here to help you out. I don't finance lifestyles. And I did have one daughter who took some time off from college, and she was going to find herself. And I said, well, you know what? You're old enough to find yourself, then you're old enough to get an apartment and get a job and work, because dad doesn't finance lifestyles. But if you go back into school, I'll finance that. And to her credit, she did it for about a year and got a job and got her apartment, but she wasn't making any money because she was front desk at one of the hotel chains and making minimum wage. And she came by to see me, and she said, man, by the time I buy my gas and pay my rent and pay my cell phone bill, I don't have any money. I said, well, get used to it. That's minimum wage. And that's what your life's going to be like. She says, well, maybe I should go back to school. I said, well, we can have that discussion. If you want to go back to school, that's something that we can talk about. And so she got back on the right track. She's doing well. But in any respect, so that's the big answer to your question. I would have started a lot earlier, and I'm glad that my kids realized the advantage of doing that as well.
I love that answer. One of my favorite thought leaders is a radio host and has done multiple classes. His name's Dave Ramsey, and Dave does that illustration with Ben and Arthur in Financial Peace University.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Boy, 10 years can make a huge difference.
Makes a huge difference.
But
Start early.
I will say for your audience, it's never too late to start. as you may have mentioned, I went back to the academy as the president and CEO of the Alumni Association. And that's a full-time job at a service academy, and it's separate from the military. I ran a nonprofit, a 501(c). And I took that job in my 50s, late 50s. I was there for about just shy of 10 years. But I put away another $1 million just in 401(k) and putting it aside. And so it's never too late, even if you got some years behind you, to save and invest, and it makes a difference.
Great advice. The last question that I have for you is from a past guest of ours, and he was part of episode 5. He was my career coach, and I know that people is one of the big important parts of your 4P pillar program and approach. So Chris Oakley, when I asked him that question, he shared this advice from a mentoring group, which is another concept in the book that you talk about. And he was in his 20s. The leader of the mentoring group said, guys, you got to read this book by Andy Stanley called The Principle of the Path. And in the book, Andy Stanley has his reader write their own obituary. So Chris did that, and he lived on mission for over a decade. And it goes to show what you can accomplish in your 20s and 30s when you're living on mission with a plan, or that other P in your 4 Ps. Well, Chris tragically passed away 2 years ago. And as a way of remembering Chris and as a memorial to him, I asked this question because his answer was that he wrote his own obituary. And I like to ask our guest, Captain T, if you had someone, an obituary maybe seems a little bit distant, almost like a newspaper article about someone's life. You had someone that was a loved one, maybe one of your daughters, writing out the eulogy that they might deliver at your funeral. What would you want to be remembered by?
I would like to be remembered as a good guy who did the right thing, who treated everybody with dignity and respect, and was there to help when people needed help. And I was in a position to provide that help. An obituary will never be how much you worked, but basically how you were looked upon and respected by other people. And so I would have hoped to have lived a life, and trying to live a life currently as best I can, to exude those principles.
Captain T, thank you. This has been an amazing experience. It's been the ride of a lifetime for me. I'll have to admit to you, and as a way to thank you for your time today, I woke up pretty sore. I woke up pretty tired. I'm a youth lacrosse coach for a bunch of rambunctious 5th grade boys and 4th grade boys, and yesterday was our first practice. We had wonderful weather. You know how it is in the Rocky Mountain region here in Colorado. We can have beautiful days followed by snow
Right.
the next day.
Exactly.
and then it melts off pretty quick. You got to adapt to variety. And I'll tell you, just this morning, I was tired by no other situation, just beside that I'm getting back into the swing of things as a coach. And physically, I was exhausted and was tired, and I've got a lot going on at work. And I was not in a positive mental space coming into the office this morning, but I've been uplifted by your advice and by your time today on the show. So I thank you for that. I know our podcast audience, our Calibrate crew that's out there listening, is going to feel the same way. And so, Captain T, thank you for your wisdom. Obviously, go out, get the book. Amazon's the easiest spot. You can go to Greenleaf Book Group, and that's gbgpress.com. But check out William T Thompson, Esquire, Captain T, and the Flight to Excellence. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati. And as I love to say, for Captain T, for Ann Russell, our podcast producer, this is another episode in the books. We'll see you around the neighborhood. Thanks, everybody.